Sammy, I didn't want to say this in front of the others, but you know what I think the most important thing in life is? It's love. You want to know what I love?
Beer, Norm?
Yeah, have a quick one. Well, Sammy, I love that stool. If there's a heaven, I don't want to go there unless my stool is waiting for me. And I'll tell you what, even God better not be on it.
You wouldn't dare.
That, of course, is from the series Cheers. I guess if you're really young, you might not know that, of course, is from the series Cheers. Ted Danson has gone from playing the bartender and bar owner, the recovering alcoholic ex-baseball player, because there's so many of those people who buy bars, right? He's gone from playing that to somebody who's in personal contact with God on a regular basis in The Good Place. So we're talking about bars today. And, you know, you could sort of say that Cheers is a Rorschach test for how you think about bars. I mean, for one of the axes on which you would evaluate bars, right? I don't know. I look at Cheers and there seems to be something. I know they're really trying to make you feel as though this is a place where everyone knows your name and, oh, you've got your stool. And it seems very sad and limiting to me that these people, you know, like George and Cliff, they go to work and then they go to this bar, and it seems to be about it in terms of their lives. But I know a lot of people who feel, in fact, I think almost everybody except me feels the opposite way, which is that this is a place where everybody knows your name. This is a source of community. This is a place where you can kind of unwind and be yourself. It is that proverbial third space that we talk about a lot in America. You're not at home, you're not at work, but you need another place where you can be, and a bar is one of those places. So we're going to talk about this today, partly, of course, because bars, like pure bars that aren't also serving food, they still have not reopened in Connecticut. Not clear when they will reopen in Connecticut. They will be one of the last businesses to reopen during COVID. And so do people miss them? Is life that much more impoverished without bars? I think, once again, almost everybody on the show today and everybody listening would say, yes, life is more impoverished without bars. I'm probably a little bit of an outlier there, and it has something to do with being an introvert, I think. Anyway, let's get going here with the guests. So to be my companion for the entire show today, we've lined up a name and a voice that you will probably recognize, Rand Richards Cooper, contributing editor at Commonweal, and he writes the In Our Midst column for Hartford Magazine. Also joining us for this first segment, Christine Sismondo, the author of America Walks Into a Bar, A Spirited History of Taverns and Saloons, Speakeasies, and Grog Shops. So I'm going to begin by having each of you talk about a bar where everybody did know your name and that you regard with fondness. And I know that each of you has these stories. So, Rand, why don't you go first? Exotically, your bar of this kind is probably going to be one in Germany.
Yes, Colin, as I was telling you before, my bar hopping and bar going days took a big nosedive after I became a father about 14 years ago. There was a slot that used to be filled with hanging with my buds in bars. Then suddenly it was filled with being a dad. That's sort of an interesting topic in terms of what bars are and what they do for us and what they yield to. But so my bar going days when I was a young person, I was living mostly in Germany. And the bar I want to talk about very briefly was in Germany. And let me just give a little bit of a conceptual framework. I'm sure it will mean something to Christine as well. It strikes me that the sort of two poles of the kinds of bars that perhaps we like and we think about and we go to are, on the one hand, like your tribal bar, your turf, your neighborhood, the place where it's small and everyone knows you. And in fact, if strangers come in, you know, they might get a glare. They might not necessarily be enthusiastically welcome versus the kind of la-di-da shishi bar that I go to as a restaurant reviewer much more often now. When I lived in Germany, there was a tiny bar. It was called Das Schweizer Haus, the Swiss house. It was literally in a neighborhood. It had been grandfathered in. You'd never know that there was a bar there. It was in the basement of this house. And a little old 70-year-old lady was the bar, named Jutta, was the bartender. And she was from Berlin. And Berliners are known for their sort of caustic personalities. They're sort of the New Yorkers of Germany. And my basketball team would sit there. There were 3 tables. People smoked cigarettes, the room filled with smoke. Nobody ever came into that place who didn't always come into that place. I was grafted onto this team of German basketball players, and they would do all of these weird sort of drinking rituals, including Stiefeltrinken, which is drinking out of a boot that you pass, drinking beer out of a boot that you pass from table to table, from seat to seat.
It's amazing that it hasn't caught on more.
No, it's unbelievable. It's a glass boot, not a real boot. And just at the other extreme, I say, just to flesh out this conceptual framework, there are many cosmopolitan bars, especially in Berlin. Berlin is a city I love. You can go to the Newton Bar, right in the Gendarmerie, the center of Berlin, and you're sitting there among giant portraits of nudes taken by Newton. It's the most cosmopolitan, international, cool bar where no one knows anything. And so I'm just struck by this large spectrum that bars are situated on, between, for want of a better phrase, the cosmopolitan on the one hand and the tribal on the other. And Schweizerhaus, where Jutta would get drunk with us, and by the end of the evening, she would start singing to me, because I was an American. She would sing, "Pardon me, boy, is that the Chattanooga choo-choo? Woo, woo," which was the only English she knew. She died about a year later, and all of us on the team in the bar, we all attended her funeral, and the only people at her funeral were her bar goers.
But everybody knew her name. So, Christine, you've got a couple of stories that are there early on in the book about your own experiences. I think one's in Toronto and one's in New York. But pick one of those and kind of lay it out the same way.
Well, I mean, I did belong to a bar, and I've never really thought about it exactly as tribal, but indeed it was. I always thought of it more like a club, and it wasn't a completely closed club, but it was definitely tight knit, and it would take people a while to get in and understand what was going on there because there was so much shared history. And I really fell into this because I was working there when I was in university, and it took me a while to really get involved in the culture of it because you're playing a different role when you're working. But it celebrated its 25th anniversary this year. It couldn't because it was closed due to COVID. And, I still will pop in there, not as often, but 2 or 3 times a year and say hello to people. And I still know the owners who are working behind the bar. And it's nice to have that in a relatively large city where people aren't always that friendly, to have this sort of home base to go to. And, for me, over the years, a lot of things came from that. Aside from meeting my partner, there were times where you'd get jobs from people at the bar, or you'd get help with whatever you were working on at that moment. And I used to say, got a problem? Go to the bar. It'll get solved.
Or you'll have to.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, one of the points you make about one of these bars is, it's the kind of place also where they took up for a collection for somebody who couldn't pay for her cancer treatments. They would sort of pretend to accidentally make steaks for an imaginary customer, and they would actually go to the guy who had lost his job and was having trouble making ends meet. There is that other kind of tribalism where you take care of one another. So I want to just switch. By the way, I've never experienced anything like either of the two things that the two guys have described, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. So before I come back to Christine on this, Rand, to me, one of the questions is, do really good things happen in bars? In other words, we go to bars as this third space where, in fact, and the kind of bar that you describe in Berlin is maybe the kind of place where you think maybe you'll by chance run into somebody really interesting and you'll have a really interesting conversation and great ideas come up that way. And Christine is going to talk in just a couple of seconds about how some of the seeds of the American experiment were sown in 18th century bars. But I mean, to you, is a bar a place where lots of really good things happen?
To me, the good thing that has happened over and over again in bars has been the deepening of friendships that that I already had. The times when I've met someone in a bar that has changed anything in my life, nothing comes to mind. But especially when I was more than I am now in the context of hanging with a particular group of young people when I was young, and we were sort of looking for a place, and the place could could sort of semi become ours. We were regulars there. We were Stammgäste in Germany, as you know, Colin, the Stammgast, that literally means the client who becomes a member of our tribe. And they put little signs on tables, Stammgast, where only the regulars get to sit. When you accede to that status, in a German bar, it's like, whoa, I'm really part of the scene. So I don't think good things to me happen in the sense of this is a huge people mixer and destiny mixer, and who knows what's going to come out of it. Not that for me it was just fellowship, amplified by beer.
Okay, so Christine, one of the things, as I say, that you do document in the book is the degree to which the bars that were present prior to the founding of the United States were there and were a place where people could meet. We have musical confirmation of this now, thanks to the musical Hamilton. Let's remind everybody of that.
Let's have another round tonight.
Let's have another round tonight.
Let's have another round tonight.
Raise a glass to freedom, something they can never take away, no matter what they tell you. Raise a glass to the four of us. Tomorrow there'll be more of us.
So, Christine, of course, we hear Lafayette and Hamilton and Lawrence and Mulligan singing about this idea. It's a wonderful device. It's a song that never fails to move me when I watch it performed. But it's not completely an invention, right? I mean, that idea is very present in the history.
It's not at all an invention. It wouldn't have been unique. It would have been the norm, really. It wasn't confined to a few characters. I mean, basically, in colonial, America, what happened was that people put up taverns first and city halls later. And so, but what wound up happening from that is that the tavern became everything else that we were waiting to build. And it was really important in terms of being a way for people to travel from one point to the other, because you needed somewhere to rest, and they were the post offices, they were everything. So they just became a really important center for almost every settlement in North America at that time. And when even after people built proper courtrooms and churches and meeting halls and things along those lines, people still went to the bar because it was their habit, because it was their tradition, and sometimes because it was the warmest place in town. So it's only natural that some of the sort of revolutionary fervor came out of people meeting in bars and talking about what they thought was fair and what wasn't.
Right. And there's sort of a counter theory that in fact the Enlightenment didn't really get started until there were coffee houses, that bars and taverns, because you tended to have less coherent conversations, that you were less likely to remember, and that I think they were kind of places where people of a certain type would all congregate together, as opposed to people kind of exchanging opinions and ideas across the bounds of subcultures. The coffee was maybe as intrinsic, if not more intrinsic, to the kind of foment that led to the revolutionary spirit than alcohol. But there is, as the song illustrates, and as I think you're suggesting, a way, and the way Rand's stories of Stammgast also suggest, a way that people bond. They form the kind of bonds in bars that maybe will survive challenges, even in the form of authoritarianism and violence.
Yeah, I think that the coffee houses are a really important part of this, and I think that from what I have sort of looked into, there would have been quite a few places called coffee houses that would have sold quite a lot of alcohol as well. Mm-hmm. But indeed, I think that there is something about the particular nature of alcohol and the way that it operates on the body that lowers inhibitions and strengthens bonds, and not always. Sometimes it creates violence, and it creates problems between people who are in the bar together. But that sort of that is something that coffee isn't going to do as much as alcohol is.
And Rand, when you tell that story of the little bar in the basement, and you've got a kind of similar story about a bar in New London, where, I mean, you sort of think about the ordinary business model anywhere in the so-called and justly named hospitality industry. The idea would be that you would want as many people as possible flowing into any kind of establishment like that. But in fact, not every bar is like that. I mean, the hospitality industry would struggle to understand a tradition where there are actually signs on certain tables of a bar designating them for regulars. I know the New London one you talk about is another one where you can't necessarily walk in off the street and expect to be welcomed into this coterie. So what's going on there? Why even have a place like that?
So I think bars, bars are doing different things, and different bars are doing different things. And I spend a lot of time in these days in bars that are adjacent to and associated with restaurants, where, bartenders are making all these creative craft artisanal cocktails that are great. I love that stuff. I get their recipes. I talk with the bartender about their recipes. I bring them home. The recipes home, not the bartenders. And I make the drinks. These are bars that are in the business of acquiring customers. And they're going to do it in as open and inviting a way as possible. They want people to mix and mingle, and they want to sell things to them, and they want to amplify their business and make more money and be a place that people talk about. The other kinds of bars, like the Dutch Tavern in New London, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants to go be reminded of what a small town, tightly knit community tavern is about. It's been there forever. It's been owned by the same person forever. It has all sorts of local interests. The guy who owns it was the lead man for a very popular band called the Reducers that played in that famed L&G Club decades ago. But bars like this are more about asserting identity and guarding and protecting identity than they are about gaining customers and opening up, to new people. So I see very different functions going on in different kinds of bars. And personally, I enjoy each for the very different thing it has to offer.
Well, Christine, I think one of the points that you make too is that a bar, particularly for certain types of subcultures, a bar can be an enclave, and it can be a place where people who do not necessarily feel safe out in the world because of their ethnicity, or I think especially because of their sexual orientation, can feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the 20th century example that is phenomenal to look at. I actually did my dissertation on gay bars in Toronto from 1947 to 1981. We had sort of I don't want to call it Toronto's Stonewall because it's not actually accurate, but we had some protests arise from bars in 1981 that can definitely be linked to the bars. And so I went through and I read all of the accounts that I could find of a number of gay bars in Toronto in the early 50s. And, we tend to think of Toronto as a very buttoned up, straight-laced place where things didn't happen. But there was this massive Halloween ball that happened every year right in the downtown core. And it was only because people felt very safe in that bar that it was allowed to, to flourish like that. And, you just see this sort of repetitive thing consistently. The people who went, they would say, I felt like I was wearing a mask all the time. And then I could walk into that door and all of a sudden take it off and be myself.
And so,
Christine,
go ahead, Rand.
Colin, can I ask Christine a question?
Sure.
We haven't talked about this, but obviously in recent weeks, as bars have tried to reopen, and then we've all watched scenes in different parts of the United States with people clamoring in bars, and those of us who live in precautionary Connecticut sort of go, ooh, and there's been even vilification of people who go to bars. And it occurred to me, we've talked here so far about really the positive aspects of bars and of how we see bars. They have a certain civic function, Christine, that you laid out historically. We've talked a lot about bars as friendship building places, but we've always been, particularly Americans, very ambivalent about bars, and they've often been vilified, and they're connected with through film and literature, not to mention the nightly news, with a lot of the more sinister and dark sides of life. I don't know, do you cover this in your book at all, sort of the particularly American ambivalence about bars?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I'm very sympathetic about it. I'm not, a libertarian kind of like let the bars do what they want kind of person or anything like that. I think that, for example, if you go back to the gay bars that I was talking about, you see such a difference between what we had in Toronto in terms of the way that our gay bars were run as kind of with a relative amount of tolerance, and what happened in Stonewall, where they were run by the mafia and people were exploited when they went in there. And we had some of that too. I'm not trying to say we're the virtuous city and we do everything properly. We certainly don't. But there was a big difference. And certainly there have been mob run bars. There have been machine politics that ran through bars all through the late 1900s. Tammany Hall was 1800s. Tammany Hall was always associated with that. I mean, there have just been a ton of horrible episodes that you can directly trace to this kind of saloon violence.
Right. And I think that ambivalence kind of cuts both ways. So because of the pandemic, I mean, I'm probably not somebody who went out a lot in the old days, but I can use the pandemic as the reason I don't go anywhere. I don't see anybody. So a lot of my thinking about things is heavily influenced by what I can watch on the screen. And I have been rewatching The Wire. And what I'm struck by is, first of all, how many bar scenes there are, how drunk, like really, kind of alarmingly drunk, some of the major protagonists get in those scenes, and some of the bad decisions they make, and some of the kind of payphone booty calls that they make, and what I'm suddenly realizing I was too thick to get it the first time through. David Simon is kind of pointing out to us that all of these people that we're seeing getting smashed out of their minds in bars are spending their days trying to tamp down the illegal drug trade. They are part of the war on drugs. And they have very little perspective about the fact that the minute they're done working, they go someplace and, get smashed out of their minds. So I think that's another... There's a way in which bars and alcohol, we may have some ambivalence about them, but there's also a sense in which it's a much more permitted vice than a lot of other vices too. I mean, it's kind of you can do, a romanticized series like Cheers, and people won't say, well, no, that's no good. I mean, unless they're members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they're not going to say that. So yeah, I guess, Christine, we're heading towards a break here, but I guess I'm also, you must be thinking a lot about like what's going to happen next. There's clearly, first of all, bars, like a lot of businesses, they sit often on an economic razor. Their business model is usually pretty tight. They don't have a lot of flex room. So all these bars closing and struggling to reopen and they can't operate at full strength when they reopen. Do you worry that we're going to lose some of these bars that really do have some kind of cohesive purpose in America and Canada and everywhere else?
I think it's inevitable. I think that there are going to be some places that are going to be really important sort of cornerstones for the community that are going to be gone. We've lost many that I know of so far, in addition to the fancy cocktail bars. And I think that there will be some loss to community. I don't really know what happens to some of the connections that are only made through that. And some of the people who are making those connections are quite vulnerable people.
All right, so we're going to take a break here. We're talking to Rand Richards Cooper. He'll be with us in the following segment, along with the owner of the Anchor Spa in New Haven. We're going to say goodbye and thank you very much right now to Christine Sismondo. Her book is America Walks Into a Bar, A Spirited History of Taverns and Saloons, Speakeasies, and Grog Shops. So let's go out with one of those bar scenes that you can't not air on a show like this.
Grab Bugatti, then she walks in. Well, that's the way it goes. One in, one out. Sam.
Yes, boss.
It's December 1941 in Casablanca. What time is it in New York?
What? My watch stopped.
I bet they're asleep in New York. And I bet they're asleep all over America. All the gin joints in all the towns in all the world. She walks into mine.
I see America drinking the fabulous cocktails I make. America's getting stinking on something I stir or shake. The sex on the beach. The schnapps made from peach. The velvet hammer. The Alabama slammer. I make things with juice and froth. The pink squirrel. The three-toed sloth. I make drinks so sweet and snazzy. The iced tea, the kamikaze, the orgasm.
Oh, hands up the merchandise.
The death spasm. The Singapore sling, the ding-a-ling.
Ding-a-ling.
America, you're just devoted to every flavor I've got. But if you want to get loaded, why don't you just order a shot? Bar's open.
Okay, that is the movie Cocktail, which I'm just realizing I've never seen. And I wonder how many people who watch Cocktail, that's Tom Cruise talking, by the way. I wonder how many people who watch Cocktail get the Walt Whitman reference. I'm not sure many do. We're talking about bars here. We're talking about, what they're good for and maybe what they're bad for. But mostly what they're good for, because they are a thing that, for the most part, we don't have access to. Not the way we used to. Not for a while. Rand Richards Cooper is with us, contributing editor at Commonweal, and writes the In Our Midst column for Hartford Magazine. And in just a second, you're going to meet Carl Franz Williams, who owns the Anchor Spa, a legendary bar in New Haven. So, Rand, a couple of things. We didn't really say this in the previous segment, but, as you go around the world, bars and pubs and things like that, they're very different. And it's hard for me to sit here and say, well, the Irish do liquor so much better because, we have our problems. But when you go into Ireland, into a pub in Ireland, it's often much more of a family kind of thing, there's sort of a sense in which it isn't this place of forbidden adult pleasure, this, cave of darkness where you go to escape your life and escape yourself. Quite frequently, people bring their lives with them, which is the case in a lot of other countries. I mean, another way the United States is a little odd, maybe, is in that sense that a bar is where you go to get rid of all your other responsibilities.
Right. First of all, in many European countries, kind of the walls between the bar and everywhere else are somewhat more permeable. Drinking laws aren't so strictly enforced. People aren't carded, and that has to do with themes way larger than we can discuss right here. But Americans, we have the things that we're good at, and among them, for instance, are making ever more inventive kinds of drinks. I remember when the whole kind of craft beer thing took off here, 15 years ago or so. Some German and Belgian friends of mine, they basically complained about what they considered to be the absurd proliferation of kinds of beers and ales that we have, and Americans have a way of taking something good and then just amplifying it forever and becoming more and more ostentatiously and interestingly creative, and that certainly has happened with cocktails, the kinds of cocktails that get made for you. It's like I listened to that thing from the movie. If you want to get loaded, just order a shot. I don't know. It's just increasingly the bars that I go into in this country are really divided into those kinds of bars, where like the biker bar I told you about, I visited with friends, and a kind of pompous young friend of mine said, well, can I see your wine list? And the tattooed waitress stared at him and said, yeah, here's the wine list, red or white. And those bars continue to play an important role, but they're almost sometimes, at least in this market, overwhelmed by, I don't know, maybe your anchor, maybe Carl will be able to talk to this. Like, how do you find your path through an ever more complex and even bewildering, mixology forest?
Right. Before we get to Carl Franz Williams, we have to have bar stories here. And so I happen to know one about you because, like a lot of bar stories that I'm involved in, it's a story where I go home early and then other things happen. So you and I were out there. We were out in Litchfield doing some readings for our sort of our writers group or writers organization, and that was run by our friend Andy Tebow. And I'll let you pick up the story of La Cupola.
So I was new to this area, and Colin, as you always are amused by this part of the story, I didn't understand that Litchfield was close to Hartford. I thought Connecticut was a bigger state. I don't know. I thought it was New York somewhere near Litchfield. And that if I was going to drive out from Hartford to Litchfield, I should probably get a room for the night. So I got a room at the hotel adjacent to this restaurant. And after we did our function and you guys left, I repaired to the bar, and there was some older, that is to say, they were in their 50s, guys in there, and they were Italian Americans. And the area, Torrington in particular, had a lot of, and I didn't know this at the time, Italian immigration throughout the 20th century. I think a lot of these guys were masons involved in various aspects of masonry. And they were sitting at the bar drinking some Italian liqueur that I wasn't familiar with. And I as I recalled it was very herbal and sort of brown and almost tarry. And they so nicely invited me to join them and asked me questions. I was a youngish guy, and they kept treating me to rounds of this tarry tart liqueur. And, and I was very glad to have their hospitality. I had no idea what I was drinking. It seemed a little bit cough syrup like. I believed, Colin, just as a postscript to that story, many decades later now, I believe it was Amaro. And I have had Amaro used in a great cocktail made by the bartender at the Beam House in Glastonbury, who's a guy named Anthony DeVita. And he makes a terrific gin-based cocktail called The First Impression that involves gin, Amaro, and a liqueur I've never known what to do with called chartreuse, known as Green Fire. He uses yellow chartreuse, but my parents had a bottle of chartreuse that they must have kept for 30 years in our house. It never went down, it never diminished. They never used it, never knew what to do with it. Anyway, that same liqueur that those Italian gentlemen at La Cupola 23 years ago gave me is now sort of featured in a lot of upscale cocktails. I kind of wish I could share one with them.
Right. But basically, that night it was like a lot of nights in bars. It was really fun. It was really kind of exotic. It was an introduction to a whole bunch of people you wouldn't have met any other way. And then you woke up with the worst hangover.
I got to tumble upstairs into the hotel afterwards.
All right, so let's talk to somebody who we're amateurs. So let's talk to somebody who really knows whereof he speaks. That's Carl Franz Williams. He is the owner of the Anchor Spa, a historic and legendary site in New Haven. First of all, welcome to our show.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So maybe I'll just ask you a real baseline question. Why are you in the bar business? There's something about this business and about this world that you love enough to invest so much of your life into it. So tell us about that.
Well, it's very interesting. Just how you were describing earlier, this sort of how cocktails and drinks have become such a complex and interesting and crafty and all these words that almost get used too much now, artisanal space. And it's actually some of that attracted me to it. So my background is a little bit different than a lot of people who own craft bars or own bars in general. I went to Yale, got a degree in electrical engineering, and then started my career in in manufacturing for Procter, then went to brand, and then went to Pepsi. And while at Pepsi working in brand, I started talking to mixologists for inspiration on a project. I was working on an innovation project for next great Pepsi concept, and I started talking to these mixologists for inspiration. I was also talking to like Lower East Side hipsters and whoever else. And I was blown away by the craft, by the idea that you could have a culinary experience in a glass, that it wasn't just an ends to a mean to get hammered. It was actually an experience, culinary experience. Those things really attracted me. And at the time I had opened a craft cocktail, cocktail lounge, not cocktail, sorry, craft coffee lounge, coffee place. And we were doing latte art and things like that. And this was a side project I was doing while I was at Pepsi. And so, so there were two things. It was this sort of artisanal thing, but it was also just having this space that felt good, that anyone could walk into, that you felt at home, that you just felt special in, regardless, wherever you were, you could find a great coffee shop. And I saw craft bars taking this culinary experience and mixing it with these really interesting and unique spaces. And that intrigued me so much so that I decided to open my first cocktail bar, which was 67 Orange Street.
So we should just quickly say that in 2014, and New Haven, first of all, I think it's fair to say, and I don't mean to slight Hartford or in any other city, New Haven has a unique bar culture among Connecticut cities, and there really are these bars that are these vital hubs of communication, socializing, and a kind of mixing of different strata and different groups from New Haven. So people these days get very excited also about, for example, The Ordinary. I don't know, when I first started putting stuff on social media about this, people started chiming in about it. But there was this sort of oof that you could hear out of New Haven around 2014 when the Anchor closed. And people really treated it as a civic crisis. They didn't treat it as this place where I used to go get a drink isn't there anymore, it's not open. It was really kind of understood by a lot of people whom I know to be something of a civic or municipal crisis. So maybe talk about that and what your role was.
Yeah, so, I mean, having gone to Yale, I always had, New Haven and downtown New Haven in particular always had sort of this, that was where I came to myself, right? So there was always this attraction to the area. I had opened, I had a couple bars in New York City at the time. I heard about what was happening with the Anchor. Now, I actually didn't go to the Anchor much I actually didn't drink much when I was in college. I can probably count the number of times I was drunk in college on one hand, which is really surprising when you think what I do now. I heard about the closing of the Anchor, and I wanted to open some more places. And so I started to read a little bit more and just to understand the story, and the history of it was outstanding. So part of what was happening was a lot of the bars that were in downtown New Haven that had this really historical legacy to them. They were being closed for whatever reasons, and they were reopening with different names, different concepts, different, the interiors were changed. And I think for those who value New Haven and downtown New Haven in particular, they were starting to see this, like the legacy, the culture, the architecture all sort of disappear at once. And the Anchor for a lot of folks, I mean, having been there since 1939 with this like maritime blue Art Deco exterior, that was really a throwback to the period, unlike anything else that was downtown. The idea that could go away was, I think hit people pretty hard. Now, people weren't necessarily all going to the bar in droves at that point. Like it had slowed down. It wasn't necessarily being run at its best at that point, and there were some issues there. But I think just the iconic nature of it, the idea that it was there, meant so much to people that they felt that it was not right, that it should change, that it should leave.
Rand, I know that you may have some specific question you want to ask Carl Franz Williams, but I know that one of the things you and I have been communicating about is this idea that one of the things that bars kind of sell is intimate face-to-face contact. You sit close to people that you either know or are getting to know. And it seems so challenging right now. But Rand, I'll let you maybe even pose a question about that. Well,
I just, it occurred to us as we were talking through the show beforehand, Carl, obviously restaurants have taken a big hit. But you can move a restaurant outside, and in many ways, it enhances the core experience. That's not always true for a bar. Of course, there are kinds of bars like German beer gardens that are meant to be outside and that are lovely outside. But in many ways, at least in my sense, part of the core bar experience is being inside in a place of shelter and being physically quite intimate with each other. More than any other kind of institution, really, intimacy is kind of the core. And I mean, including, I don't just mean, sexual intimacy, but close proximity. There's often There are either confessional or secretive elements to stuff that goes on in bars, and that basic proximity and intimacy are so much a core part of the good that you're selling, that I have to imagine that you look ahead at this colossal question mark of our future with particular trepidation.
Yeah, I mean, so it's, there are so many, you go on to social media and there's a ton of demos of people teaching you how to make cocktails, and chefs teaching you how to cook. And, you can watch you can go to a Zoom happy hour and the DJ's playing. And, so all of these experiences these sort of online virtual things. And for some reason, they just still, not for some reason, obviously it's exactly what we're talking about, but they just still don't get it. It doesn't give you what you get from a bar. And, what we have, the way that I've intellectualized this is that the bar is the experience. It's like no one wants to go to an empty bar. You walk by the bar, there's no one in there, you keep on walking by. But because there's something, like you said, about this sort of coming together, and it's that jovial energy in the air. It's the happiness. It's like you don't often walk into a bar and everyone's head is down and they're grumpy. It's like happiness, the experience of happiness expressed it's literally in the air. It's wafting through.
That's such an ominous sounding, today that becomes an ominous sound, something wafting through the air.
We should say that, Carl, you are now able to conduct a kind of operations at the Anchor, partly because you also serve food. Maybe just sort of say, where are you guys at right now?
Yeah, I mean, so we, so it's been an interesting period sort of navigating this. So, I mean, we started out just doing takeout cocktails and food. And so we had a food pro, you could order. We're doing these cocktail kits where you could take them home and make our cocktails at home, and then we would teach you how to do that. And we did that. I think it did well in that it kept our name in people's minds. It kept people thinking about us. And then we were able to move into. We were a little hesitant to jump directly into doing any sort of in-person dining, so we didn't do outdoor as soon as it became available. Kind of watched a little bit to see what was going on. And then we rolled out both indoor and outdoor dining around the same time. So we're at 50% indoor right now. But
all right, we have to go to a break right here. We've been talking to Carl Franz Williams from the Anchor Spa in New Haven. We look forward to better times as we head into the break too. I want to do the thing like they do in the Oscars for the awards that were given out at some other time. Things we're sort of not going to get to today. One of them is obviously live music. Mark Orelli, the great singer-songwriter, was tweeting at me today saying, and a bunch of other musicians too, saying, "Well, let's not forget this is a place you go to hear people like me, people like us." Perform. There's also just the whole subject of work-related bars. I mean, I was a newspaper guy for a long time. There are newspaper bars, and they are just adjuncts to the newsroom. They might as well just have a door from one going to the other. There are cop bars, stuff like that. So we're not going to get to all that kind of stuff, but we are going to talk on the other side. Rand and I will talk a little bit about bars and culture. So let's hear a barroom brawl scene, sort of, that you will recognize.
Hey. We don't serve their kind here.
What?
Your droids. They'll have to wait outside. We don't want them here.
Why don't you wait out by the speeder? We don't want any trouble.
I heartily agree with you, sir.
He doesn't like you.
I'm sorry.
I don't like you either. You just watch yourself. We're wanted men. I have the death sentence on 12 systems.
I'll be careful.
You'll be dead.
This little one's not worth the effort. Come, let me get you some.
All right, we're back. Some thank yous, I got to say. One of them is to Kat Pastor, who has a death sentence in 7 systems, but she's working on it. She'll get up to 14 in no time, or however many that guy had. No, Kat Pastor is there in the studio, keeping everything going for us, making it possible for us to work remotely and firing off all the clips and music that you're hearing today and doing a lot of other stuff besides. This episode was produced by Jonathan McPants. He doesn't like you. I don't like you either. But we were very happy that you were here to talk with us and listen as we talk about bars. And we have almost no time left to talk to Rand Richards Cooper about bars and culture. Rand, if we get to nothing else, a point that you made is that we've seen so many bar fights in Westerns and Star Wars and everything else besides, but most of us have never seen a bar fight in a bar.
That's true. I think I've seen one, and I don't know. I've been in 1,000 bars maybe at this point in my life. So I've seen one fight. And Colin, you sent a link from the Martin Scorsese film, The Departed, with a just very typical bar fight with Leo DiCaprio and some other guys. But they insult each other in ways that are scathing and so wittily scripted. And it's like, not only do you never see a bar fight, but if you ever do, it's not going to be garlanded with these kinds of perfectly scathing insults as they are always in the movies. So a lot of times what we think about bars ends up being more formed by movies than our actual experience of bars.
Right. I mean, mostly what happens in bars is nothing. But I think also bars do reinforce, well, quickly, because we're almost out of time here, but you should remind people of the American Werewolf in London moment.
So my favorite depiction in movies of a bar is the bar in John Landis's film, An American Werewolf in London, which is the relatively rare thriller that's also hilariously funny. It's about two backpacking Americans who get in trouble with werewolves. But there's a tiny pub out in the Highlands of Scotland where this werewolf is, or north of England, and the pub is called the Slaughtered Lamb, and it has this terrible sign painted out front of a wolf with bloody jaws. When they walk in, it's the kind of bar where no one new ever goes. These two young American guys show up, and this room of old local geezers turns to them, and with looks of just pure malevolence. And in the way that I was talking about sort of the tribal bar before, this takes it and makes it into a sort of almost a comic film mockery of that idea. Of course, there's a dreadful murderous secret behind it about what's going on in the hills around there. But do watch American Werewolf in London if somehow you've never watched it, and look for the Slaughtered Lamb.
And also, as you're watching it, particularly if you live kind of north of Middletown, remember that David Naughton, the star of it, is a West Hartford boy, went to Conard High School.
Yes.
And was also the Dr. Pepper jingle guy. So,
Colin, do you have can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Or maybe not. Carl, it's interesting to me. I'm still coming back to this idea of these very different kinds of functions that bars play. Carl described a culinary experience in a glass, which is what I get a lot of when I go to fancy bars. But there's the other way in which the bar has, and if you go to British fiction and British movies of the 20th century, the bar is the place of sort of male escape when domesticity becomes too onerous. So culinary experience in a glass is very different from, I'm getting out of this house now.
Right. And I would say maybe the ultimate apotheosis of that in American culture is Moe's in The Simpsons, which is absolutely where all the males go to escape their responsibilities. We were happy to have the responsibility to talk to you today about bars. So many things we didn't get to cover. We have lots of clips we never got to play. It's just a big topic. But thanks to Rand Richards Cooper, to Carl Franz Williams, and to Christine Sismondo. And thanks to you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow. I think our show is going to be about heroes, unless Betsy Kaplan has changed her mind.